my name is Odin Essers. I'm curator of Maastricht University Special Collections. Tuesday, the 7th of July, is the Dutch Day of the Fairy Tale. The special collections contain over 60 fairy tale books with illustrations made by Golden Age artists at the beginning of the 20th century, such as Edmund Dulac, Arthur Rackham, and Klein Nielsen. Today I'm talking to Professor Emilie Sitzia, art and literature historian specializing in the relationship between word and image and the impact of art on audiences. Professor Sitzia also holds a special chair of illustration at the University of Amsterdam, supported by the Fiep Westendorp Foundation. We ask our students at Maastricht University what they want to know about fairy tale illustrations, artists, and books. Ms. Sitzia, can you tell us something about the golden age of illustration and the fairy tale books in the special collections?
So we call the golden age of illustration the period between 1880 and 1930s, especially in England. And it's not a specific art movement. It's rather a period when several societal progress come together and lead to a very rich production of very high quality illustration and graphic art in general. So what happened is that more and more people could read due to improvement to educational systems. For example, in France, school became compulsory. So there were readers, and there was a children book market, and there was especially a deluxe children book market before the First World War, which developed a lot. And for that market, there was a very high demand of books with illustrations. It was also the period where the Art Deco and the Art Nouveau meet. So they are very decorative art movements, and they were very popular. So you have like this combination of a lot of demand with a lot of with a very popular art movements. But then there were also progress in the techniques of lithography, for example, that allowed for more nuance mode of reproduction. By 1900s, you had really full color reproduction possible through this method. For color photography, you have to wait a bit longer. So better technique and industrialization. That means faster and cheaper production of paper and of distribution of books. So you have a convergence of readers wanting images, cheap modes of production and distribution, and an increased quality in the means to make images. So you have really all the kind of elements to create this, this golden age of illustration. So the special collection at Maastricht University has more than 60 books, I think, from this period. And what's really interesting about that collection is that it's very representative of the period. You have books by Rackham, by Nielsen, by Clark, by Dulac, and they're really beautiful books that, yeah, I love to work with. I love to work on with students. They're really a pleasure to work with.
Okay. Another question that came in from the students is, what are the languages or geographic areas most associated with fairy tale illustration?
Good question. It's a limited, so this is really limited by research and access and generally our knowledge of fairy tales. In Europe, in the 18th and 19th century, there was a consistent collecting of folk tales and a writing up of new fairy tales by people like Madame d'Aulnoy, Perrault, the Grimm brothers, or Hans Christian Andersen. And the reason for it is that the European nations at that time were forging their identities, and these tales were seen as part of that. So as a result, the main languages and geographical areas that are traditionally associated with fairy tales illustration are European, so the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and later on, of course, a bit more global via our colonial histories. But yeah, so that's why this is really a Euro-centered kind of period for that period.
All right. Can you give some examples where illustrations were changed with the translation of a tale?
So this happens all the time, and it's hard to pin down one example. Also, there's an assumption that the change in translation is due to the text, but it isn't. Even without a change in the text, you can have a change in illustration. So because illustration can adapt to their reader much more fluidly than text. So for example, Cinderella, the scene of the pumpkin. If I ask you, you probably are going to think of the wand, the magical swirl, the pumpkin changing into a carriage, the Disney version. That's what most of us think about. But there are many, many other versions. And my personal favorite is from Doré, a 19th century French illustrator. And instead, for this scene, he depicts the carving of the pumpkins. Most of us have forgotten that there is a scene of the carving of the pumpkin before it all transforms. And in it, you see a real crummy old lady, which is the fairy godmother, which is also interesting, who's carving with a massive knife the pumpkin in a dark kitchen while Cinderella is just kind of observing the technique with a candle in hand. So it's not magical at all. So you see that there's really an interpretation that always happens with the illustrations, and you don't need to go through translation for that to happen.
Okay. What kinds of entities are commonly depicted in fairy tale illustrations, and how does that map to characters appearing in the associated tales?
So that depends a lot on the fairy tales that is illustrated and on the cultural bias of the illustrator, of the public he's illustrating for. For example, 19th century German illustrators tend to illustrate fantastic, magical scenes. When they illustrate fairy tales, the emphasis is in their illustration. So the scene they choose to illustrate, the character they represent, the context they put the character in, is often of magical nature. So magical creatures, witches, transformation scenes. But when you look at the same fairy tales illustrated by French illustrator at the same period, they will be looking at the human drama, and they're going to focus on face expression, on body language of the hero, and choose particularly emotional moments of the story to translate. So really the entities depicted depend on the actual, on culturally motivated decision, even on the same tale.
Okay. Yeah, I think the next question is by the same student. Which biological species are commonly depicted in fairy tale illustrations, and which such depictions are of actual species that are now extinct but still existed when the image was created?
So are we talking about unicorns here? I'm not sure. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. But what I find really interesting with this question is that I thought for a while about it, and really it's human or human-like characters that are the most commonly depicted. So the rest is really very decorative. So for example, for organic patterns, you'll find probably some plants or animals that are extinct. But they could just as well have been extinct already, as illustrator didn't necessarily work from nature. So for example, the dodo that you find in Alice in Wonderland illustration, well, he was already extinct when the book was written. So he became extinct in the mid-17th century. So it's a good question, and something that could make a really interesting research, because that's the cusp between ecology, biology, and illustration study. And I actually think it's a really good thesis topic. So that students, get in touch. You need to have a thesis on that. But it's a really interesting kind of topic. Thank you.
Well, if you're watching, you know what to do then. Next question, where did fairy tale illustrators acquire their skills? Who employed them and for what? And what other works were created by people who illustrated fairy tales?
So this depends a lot on the period we're talking about and the country. But mostly we talk about young men that went to art school and then got commissioned to illustrate books by publishers. There are some that worked more closely with writers, but mostly the publisher's role in the choice of the illustrator is really important. So most fairy tale illustrators also had an artistic practice in graphic arts, making posters or newspapers illustration, banknotes for some of them, or painting. And some like Nielsen painted landscapes, but he also did stage sceneries, and he even worked at a later stage with the Disney studio. He actually did the Night on the Bald Mountain scene in Fantasia, which is something people don't often look at.
Okay. Has anyone done a visual phylogeny of such images, an analogy to things?
Well, to my knowledge, no, and it's a good idea. And illustration, you have to understand that illustration is still a very young field that is developing. So in the last decade, there's been a lot of discussion on just on the definition of illustration. Even that is not so clear as what people often think. And a lot of discussion also on interdisciplinary methodologies that are necessary to analyze these images. So often the methodologies, because they're in books, tend to be adaptation from the literary field. or have to do with semiotics or sociology, depending on what you're trying to get from the images. But yes, we're still working on it. And just to give you an idea of how young the field is, we finally got our first history of illustration book. That's not just an anthology or Eurocentered, in 2018. So we're still learning. So I think visual phylogeny is really something that could be interesting to explore.
Okay. Is there a database of fairy tale illustrations is the next question.
The problem when you're working with illustration is that the books are often in private collections and in libraries, and they are often indexed by author rather than illustrators. And they sometimes are not mentioned at all, the illustrators. So that makes searching for them quite difficult, but it's a great treasure hunt. And there are a few passionate people, thankfully, that have worked on specific databases. So there's a couple of them that I think are really interesting. The first one is from the Koninklijke Bibliotheek, the KB, the National Library of the Netherlands. There's a woman there called Jeannette Kok, who's done a special theme on sprookjes, on fairy tales in the KB. So I think that that's an interesting one. And of course, there is our very own repository of myths, legends, and fairy tales, which, to my knowledge, is one of the most extensive ones, because you can really go through the books, the ones that are not under copyright, obviously. The Alan Pearson collection also has a nice collection, but I don't think they have a database. So you see that it's not as straightforward as it seems to actually find the images, even in the digital times. Okay,
work to do there, I think.
To do. That's for you, the work to do there.
Absolutely, absolutely. What is your favorite fairy tale and why?
It changes all the time. And it depends a lot on what book is in my hand at the moment, or who I've met, or how great the illustrations are. So it's a really difficult question for me to answer. Last week I changed for Sherazade and the 1001 Nights, which is arguably maybe a fairy tale, maybe not a fairy tale. There's like a discussion around it. And the reason for it is because I was talking with a colleague of mine who's Moroccan, and who was explaining to me that in Morocco, Sherazade is seen as the ultimate cunning female. And I thought that was kind of weird, because in France, she's just seen as, you know, a pretty girl that tells good stories. And she was explaining that through her storytelling, she manages to actually save people, because no more young ladies are actually dying of it, of the king's madness, and to actually redeem the king. So all of a sudden, I decided that I had to go back and look at all the illustrations of the 1001 Nights, because I wanted to see if you could see that in the illustrations. So yeah, that's my new thing. But you see, it changes all the time. If you had asked me a month ago, I was still in Sleeping Beauty. So
okay, and I think it's good that it changes.
Yeah, it should. That's the whole.
Good. My question, the last question that the students came up with is, what do you think the future of fairy tales is for kids, but also for adults?
So fairy tales and the story we tell children and ourselves in general, they have a function in society. They establish social boundaries and rules and behavior type, and they put forward qualities that society values. So basically, they create a common ground on which we recognize ourselves as a society. And fairy tales throughout time have always adapted to reflect society. The thing is that our society is really now changing at an unprecedented pace. So when you ask about the future of fairy tale, you ask about what adaptations need to happen to align with our social values. And to me, there are a few things that should and that are happening in fairy tales. So you have a lot of people engaged in rewriting, illustrating fairy tales. So the first thing I think that is important is diversity. I think diversifying representation within fairy tales, so more people can recognize themselves, and also varying the fairy tales themselves. I think there's a treasure trove of tales coming from non-Western tradition that we still need to be explored, and that are maybe carrying values that are now more predominant in our society, that are, I think, important to look at. So diversity, I think, is the first thing. The second thing I think is social rules. And of course, I'm particularly interested in the place of women. As I told you, I keep thinking about it. And recently, I worked on Sleeping Beauty, for example, because Sleeping Beauty is one of those tales where that's being told over and over and over by parents to children for centuries now. But the issue of consent that became quite central in our society all of a sudden became a problem with that fairy tale, when it has never been a problem before. No one ever asked this guy is kissing that girl who's sleeping. But, you know, so it became now quite a central way for us to look at. So I went back and looked at the illustrations of Sleeping Beauty to see how it had been represented, that key moment of whether there's consent or not. And it was really interesting to me to find that there was a diversity of representation, that all the representations were not the Disney representation. So I think that was really an interesting kind of way to look at it. So the diversity, the social rules, and particularly the place of women. But I think what will probably happen is also something to do with a shift from our very human-centered, anthropocentric really tales towards tales that are centered not only on human or semi-human characters, but that are helping us think ourselves in nature as part of an ecosystem, because I think that the society is really strongly moving in that direction. And the tales have not shifted yet all towards something that is less anthropocentric. So diversity, social rules, place of woman, and a less anthropocentric kind of tales. To me, that's where I see tales going. But yeah, it's anybody's guess, really.
Okay, Ms. Sitzia, thank you very much for the interview. And let's end with a quote by British writer C.S. Lewis. "Someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again."
Thank you.